All right, welcome everyone. If you're watching this recording, let us be the first to thank you for joining us at Tableau Conference. We hope that you get as much from this training video as you did being on site with us. Be sure to watch this and all the other hands-on training content straight from your attending profile. This presentation specifically is a little bit different, and it has been modified from our original presentation at Tableau Conference. So for long and uninteresting reasons, this will be a little bit more like a training video instead of a hands-on training. But that gives you some good opportunities to rewind, pause, or even fast forward through the session as we discuss and walk through Tableau Virtual Connection.
And this is our obligatory forward-looking statement slide. Do not make any purchasing decisions based on any kind of forward-looking features. I don't think we'll be talking about any of them today, but this is to make our lawyers happy.
And another thank you is in order. Thank you for spending some time with us to review this video. If you're watching it, you probably didn't get to spend some time with us at Tableau Conference, but we're glad that you're here now and you're choosing to lean in and learn something new with us.
Yeah, so just to walk through a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to introduce ourselves. We're going to set the scene and talk about how virtual connections can be used in real life, why you might want to use virtual connections in your Tableau deployment, and then what was previously a hands-on activity, we're just going to be walking you through as a training. Unfortunately, we won't be able to answer questions live on this call since this is a recording, but we will then wrap things up after that. So I'll introduce myself first. My name is Lauren. I am a lead solution engineer here at Tableau. I'm based in Seattle. My astrological sign is a Taurus, and my favorite bar is a Gantt bar.
And my name is Brianna Fritz. I'm also a lead solution engineer here at Tableau. I've been with Tableau about 4.5, 5 years or so. I'm coming to you live from my home office in Denver. And I am a Scorpio, which sometimes suits me, sometimes doesn't, maybe only when it's convenient. But my perfect date is a continuous date.
So, Bree, we're no longer in San Diego, but when we were in San Diego, I was experiencing some troubles. I wanted to be able to meet some new people since we were in a new city, and I was giving my phone number out at a bar, and I just had this experience of a chaotic dating experience. Everyone had direct access to me. There was really no control. Sometimes I didn't know who was texting me if I didn't save their phone number. But I think that you might have had a different experience, not in San Diego, but a few years in the past.
Yeah, definitely. And this kind of dovetails nicely with our presentation. There are ways of managing your connections, both virtual and in data, where you can have all of your prospects in one place. You can choose how you contact them. For example, you can only message them, and then you can remove them directly from the app, keeping all of the weirdos from contacting you and keeping only the good ones. In fact, I actually met my husband on one of these dating apps. I went through and I found the screenshot here, and my worst fear is that someone watching this video is also in the screenshot. So if that's you, keep it to yourself. Don't let me know.
So, first and foremost, let's just talk about what is a virtual connection in Tableau. So, a virtual connection is a content type, just like a workbook or a data source. In essence, it is a master connection point to a database meant to accomplish these three things that you are seeing here. Consolidating your database connections and having a centralized place to manage things like row-level security and extract schedules can really help you simplify and save time when it comes to making sure that the right data is in the right hands, and eliminates the need for redundant access points to the same information, which can be a little bit difficult to manage sometimes. And just to show you an example of what this content type looks like in Tableau, I've included a screenshot of a virtual connection here. Lauren's VCon and VC1 is both what that would look like in a project folder.
And of course, Tableau is always iterating and improving on its products year over year. So virtual connections is no exception here. Kind of two different categories here. On the left side, we have connectivity. So as we're building our virtual connections, we have the same connection options as we do in Tableau Desktop. And we also have added support for Google Service accounts. On the other side, we've added a bit more flexibility for performance as well. So we can support view acceleration. So those top views within your Tableau site, we can play along with that view acceleration that's working with your workbooks and your dashboards. And we've also given you ultimate choice and flexibility in how you connect to those underlying connections, and also on a table by table basis. You can mix live connections and extracted connections, optimizing for either when you need your data as soon as possible, but maybe sacrificing performance, or putting performance first and maybe putting live data a little bit on a scheduled cadence.
So to contextualize a little bit of why we develop virtual connections, we wanted to take a look at how we've traditionally managed data connections in Tableau and then how that might be reimagined with virtual connections. So as with any kind of data analysis in Tableau, you start with a source of data. So let's say that this table here contains information about salaries. From there, you can make a few published data sources. Some may contain just the salaries table, maybe some contain joins or unions or relationships to other tables. And then from those, you can create workbooks, you can create entirely new published data sources with embedded connections. You can also create workbooks and create workbooks with embedded connections, or you can create entirely new published data sources. So I want to draw your attention here to the different objects that have that pink/red/ the color still up for debate outline on it. So each of those is meant to indicate what we are calling here a governance application point. And in this case, there are 6 of them. But what is a governance application point? So if you want to implement any kind of row level security policy, if you're needing to include credentials to connect to an initial data source, each of those points outlined in pink is going to be a point where you need to do that. So you can see here where there are a few different points of failure when it comes to making sure the proper policies and the proper security is being applied in each of these 6 different places. This also can create a little bit of inconsistency when it comes to, like Bree mentioned, if we wanted to use an extract, for example, this is 6 different places where that extract needs to happen, whereas it could just exist in one place in a virtual connection. So what we've done with virtual connections is isolating one of the 2 primary functions of published data sources, which contain both the connection information, so I mentioned like those credentials going back to your database, and it contains the data model information, so your relationships, your joins, your unions to other tables. Virtual connections isolates and just contains that connection information, so your content creators can have a bit more flexibility with how they model their tables, and it also frees them from the responsibility of needing to make sure that any security policies are implemented on every single downstream point from that table. Once that's been implemented at the virtual connection level, it's automatically going to be applied to everything downstream. There still is certainly an important place for published data sources because sometimes you don't want your people to be able to model the data however they want. Maybe there is a very specific semantic model that you want to use when implementing certain tables in your data source. But giving them that flexibility and lessening the number of points where you have the ability to do that in the first place is going to simplify when you need to either rotate your passwords or if you need to make some kind of a change in your security policies.
So conceptually, virtual connections create an additional layer of security between your data and your users. And that also takes some of the load off of our data stewards. But how do virtual connections work with different governance models? Everyone has a different approach of doing things, and here at Tableau, we like to be flexible. So let's look at some of our new matches and see what they have to say about their favorite governance models. So here we have Harry, and Harry thinks that it's important to put security first. He doesn't want everyone to have credentials, and the responsibility as a data steward is to keep and defend the data. So if you want data access, you're going to have to go through him. But Harry also likes long walks on the beach. I wonder if virtual connections can help someone that has a high security preference for governance. And it looks like it's a match. Virtual connections allow Harry to create a virtual connection so he doesn't have to give direct passwords to everyone. And when it's time to refresh those passwords, it doesn't take a really long time because he has a small team and they have to rotate a lot of those passwords through all the various published data sources, all the workbooks, every single piece of content on their Tableau site that needs that credential in order to engage and connect to the data. But what about someone that has a little bit more hybrid, middle of the road type of governance model? For example, we have Gina. Gina believes that all good things happen in balance, and data access is no exception. She wants her users to have access to the data, but she wants to have control over the environment that they engage with. And she wants to enable her users without exposing them to data risks, and she wants to be able to use and reuse thoughtfully. And she also likes to hike. And it looks like Gina would be a good match for virtual connections as well, because it gives her precise control over who can access which rows of data in the dashboards. And she can also use vcons to enable a large audience of users without having to give them the keys to the kingdom. And lastly, what about someone with a more permissive, a little bit more enabling governance model? Let's take a look at Sally. And Sally wants her organization to be data centric. She wants to enable their success and not stand in their way. She wants to put data in the hands of those that need it, and it's her role to serve in that purpose. And she makes a great sourdough, so great for Sally. Sally sourdough. And it looks like virtual connections would be a good match for Sally as well, because it gives authors ultimate flexibility in how they can build their data models. Like Lauren said, it's going to isolate that connection and modeling information. So if you can take care of the connection and then pass along the modeling to your analysts, they can build those tables in whatever way they need to, and allowing them to do some ad hoc, customized analysis on the fly. So there's a lot of different tools that virtual connections can match with, well, anyone. For example, we walked through a couple of these different governance policies and preferences, and virtual connections has a little bit of tools that could enable any of these policies. And before we get into our hands-on portion, or in our case, we are hands-on, you are going to watch, but Virtual Connections offers tools for every kind of data strategy, no matter where you fall. But let me leave you with these 4 S's. Virtual Connections offer security, simplicity, spend, and synchronicity. So security, knowing that only specified users can see specific data. Simplicity in managing a lot of data and a lot of users at scale, especially when the credentials change periodically. Spend can really make a big impact because it's going to consolidate your queries to your underlying data. If you use a database that charges per query, you can save a lot of money just by having a single connection point managing that information transfer instead of tens of hundreds of individual connections. And lastly, we have synchronicity, to have your data on the same refresh schedule from the same source. So for example, if you have one data source refreshing at 8 a.m. and another is refreshing at noon, then that content is out of sync for at least half of the day, despite being connected to the same underlying data.
Now, without further ado, let's make a Tableau virtual connection. All right. So I am going to flip over into my own Tableau Cloud site here, and we're going to walk through 3 different examples of types of ways that you could utilize and implement a virtual connection. So just to start out here, we're going to just build a new basic virtual connection with not a whole lot of policies applied to it. So I'm going to drop down in my menu here and click on New Virtual Connection.
Hey, Lauren, before you get too far, could you zoom your browser just a little bit? The font might be a little bit small.
That's a good idea. Let's
Command plus. There you go.
that a little better?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so the initial Connect experience in a virtual connection is going to look very similar to any kind of Connect experience in Tableau. So if you're connecting from your browser in web edit, or if you're connecting from Tableau desktop, you're going to get a similar view of possible databases to connect to. So the sample data that we're going to be accessing today is in a Snowflake database, and this is always the most fun part of any demo, watching someone copy and paste credentials from the other screen. Let's do, I want to use username and password, and I want to use this. All right, I want to use my default warehouse, and I'm going to look at my virtual connections here. So if you are familiar with connecting to data in Tableau, that process is just selecting my warehouse, selecting my database within my Snowflake connection, and now I see a list of all of my tables that me as this user who has logged in has access to and is able to pull into this virtual connection. So I am going to select all of these tables and drag and drop them all out into my blank canvas here, prompting me to add tables. So we love dragging and dropping in Tableau. So that is something that did not change. So before getting into building anything off of this virtual connection, I am going to just do a quick preview, similar to how I'm connecting in either the web editor or in desktop. I have several preview options just to make sure that I'm looking at the data that I think I'm looking for. So it looks like this employees table and this invoices table is about what I'm expecting. So I'm just going to take a look at that there. And I am going to publish this virtual connection. I am going to publish this, let's call it just to my default folder, and let's call it TC24 and publish. So now, going to this virtual connection, this is what a virtual connection might look like in the context of a Tableau environment. You might notice I have a bit of a silly sample name on my site here, but you can take a look at the tables that I have access to, and I can see that these are all live connections. So to build something off of this virtual connection, I'm going to go back to my home screen, and I want to build a new workbook here. So again, a very similar experience for my workbook as if I was connecting to a published data source or as if I was connecting to an initial data warehouse. So instead of filtering by looking at my published data sources, I am going to change this type filter to virtual connections. I can see that TC24 is a virtual connection that I'm able to connect to. I'm going to click on connect. Now the word connect, I've said so many times, it doesn't sound like a word anymore. But I'm going to use my invoices table. I'm going to drag and drop this out just as if I would if I was connecting directly to my Snowflake database in my workbook itself. So I'm just going to update this really quick, and I can see that this is going to be the same data that I just connected to for the first time in my virtual connection once this preview loads. So I get my customer ID, my country, and opening up this new sheet, I can interact, drag and drop, and build out my fields exactly like I would if I was connecting to a database here. So maybe I want to take a look at quantity. I can drag and drop that out. Maybe I'll put that onto rows, and maybe I'll put city on my columns here. Maybe I can give this a sort, flip this. So the interaction experience is very similar. So the only thing that's really different is that instead of connecting directly to a database or connecting directly to a published data source, I'm connecting to my virtual connection. And I have the ability to model these tables any way that I would like. So I'm not going to do this, but I can see that I can drag and drop out my table here, and a relationship noodle is going to be what automatically appears. So if I wanted to create a union with these tables, if I wanted to create a relationship, I have that flexibility because I'm connecting to a virtual connection. Whereas if I was connecting to a published data source, that model would already be built out for me. So I wouldn't have that same kind of flexibility to make this specific to what I'm looking for in this use case or in this workbook. And that concludes exercise 1. So we just built a basic virtual connection. We created a new workbook and built content in that workbook that is being fed from that virtual connection. So the next thing we're going to do is create a user-based policy. So I am now going back into my virtual connection editor. And instead of looking just at my tables here, I'm going to draw your attention to this data policies tab up at the top. So the data policy tab is where I'm going to implement any kind of row level security calculation. And if you have created row level security policies on your published data sources in the past or in workbooks in the past, the syntax is going to be the exact same. And if you haven't built a policy like this in the past, the syntax for creating a virtual connection policy or any kind of user-specific calculation is exactly the same as any kind of Tableau calculation syntax that you may have used in the past. So I'm going to create a new policy here, and I want to create it on my invoices table. So I'm going to drag and drop my invoices table out onto my view. And you'll notice that I have 2 options that are showing up for me as I'm dragging and dropping this out. I have add as a policy table and add as an entitlement table. We will touch on entitlement tables in the next exercise, but for this exercise, I want you to think of your policy table being the table that you want your policy applied to. So the meat of the data that you want to be filtered by your policy. So I'm going to drag and drop this invoices table out onto my policy table. And now what I'm going to do is write my condition. So I know that in this case, my invoices table has a column that's called salesperson. And I want that salesperson column to be used as my tool for filtering the data based on who's looking at the data. So I am going to use my salesperson field. And what I want my calculation to do is see that if the person who's logged in, the person viewing the data, has the same full name as the name that's in the salesperson row. So, for example, Janet Leverling. If I'm logged in as a user and my name is Janet Leverling, I should be able to view these rows. If my name is Janet Leverling, I should not be able to view the data that's within these rows because the salesperson value is different than the value of my full name. So how do we do this? Tableau has a few user-specific and group-specific functions that are designed to read the user who is logged in and return that username as a part of the calculation. So what I'm essentially saying here is that if my salesperson is equal to, the function is called full name, this full name function reads the username of the person who's logged in. So if I'm asking if the salesperson is equal to the full name, I'm going to return with either a true or a false statement. And if that statement is true, I will be able to view that row of data. So let's try this out. Before I'd even need to worry about publishing this, and before I, wouldn't be sure if my policy is actually filtering the right data, I can use some functionality that was similar to what you might recognize from working in Tableau Desktop, looking at viewing your data with a certain policy applied and previewing as a specific user. So my name is Lauren Smith, or in this case, my full name is none of your business when I am logged in as this user. And I don't exist in this data set, so I don't see any data with this policy applied. I can see that my total number of rows is 0 out of 1,700. But I believe Laura Callahan is a user in my site here, and I happen to know that Laura Callahan is a salesperson that exists in this data set. So sure enough, as I select that user, I can view all of the rows of data that Laura has access to, which appears to be 499 out of the 1,716 total rows in the data. And I can see that the salesperson listed in this whole column here, they're all going to be Laura Callahan because the salesperson field is equal to the full name, Laura Callahan, of the person that we're previewing the data as. So if I publish this again, refresh this, and I go back into my Tableau workbook here, and I open up my new sheet, you might notice that I can't view any data. So that means that our policy is working as expected, because since I'm logged in as Nunya Business and not Laura Callahan, I'm not going to be able to view any of the data that I was previously able to access, because those rows aren't available to me. In fact, if I drag and drop city out here again, oh, hold on, I'll need to refresh to make sure that policy is applied, and refreshing my data set here.
I think city came off your row too.
Oh,
you're still getting
okay.
0.
Still getting 0. So if I bring my city out here, I shouldn't even be able to see what cities are involved, because none of those rows are available to me. So that concludes the second part of our virtual connection exercises. So we've built a basic virtual connection. We have built a basic policy, a basic user-based policy. But I mentioned that I would touch on the entitlement table option when I was building this policy out. So now I want to build another policy using an entitlement table. So I am going to go back to my data policies tab, and I'm going to create a new policy here. And I want this to be on my orders table. And so since the orders table is the meat of the data that I'm going to be filtering, I'm going to drag and drop that out onto my policy table. And I am going to drag and drop my employees table out onto my entitlement table. So we mentioned that a policy table is going to be the table you want the policy to apply to. The entitlement table is going to be a way for you to map data from the user who's logging in to what they should be able to view. So it's pretty rare that in a data table that contains the meat of what you're trying to analyze, it's pretty rare that that table is also going to include direct information based on direct information relating the person who's logged in to that row of data. So for example, if I'm looking at a table full of invoices, typically salesperson wouldn't be in that table, but maybe my region or my team name might be on that table. So I don't want to have to include a bunch of extraneous columns in my data table to map that data back to the user who should be logging in, but that's where an entitlements table comes in. So I might be able to then say, Lauren is in the West region, and mapping that West region back to the data that's in the meat of our table. Lauren should therefore, based on this entitlement, only be able to view data that's coming from the West region. So it's a little bit confusing, but if you've used entitlements tables before, this is going to function exactly the same as it would previously. We also have a great white paper based on row-level security that you can find in our documentation on the Tableau website. But hopefully walking through the process of building this policy will help this make a bit more sense. So the first thing I want to do now that I have my orders table dragged out as my policy table and my employees table dragged out as my entitlements table is create a relationship between these two tables. So I do need to have something in common between these two tables to be able to make them work together and to communicate effectively. And I happen to know that employee ID is a field that I have in both of these fields. They don't, or both of these tables rather. They don't need to have the exact same name. You just need to know that they're going to contain similar data. So these are both called employee ID, but maybe this is going to have different capitalization or something on it. As long as you select the right field to relate to, it should work. So my orders table and employees table are now connected by employee ID. So you might notice as I'm previewing my orders table down below here, I have a couple of different fields that are available to me, like my ship city, ship name, customer ID, and I have this employee ID field. But it doesn't have anything to do with a salesperson name or with an employee name or anything like that. But this is where my employees table comes in. Even though my orders table doesn't directly have any information relating to which employee should be able to view which rows, it does have this employee ID field. And if I go into my employees table, I can see that that employee ID is going to be one unique value for each of my different employee names. And this has a little bit more detailed information about the employees that I might want to be filtering by. So we see our same Laura Callahan here as a full name in this employees table. But there's also some personally identifiable information that's in here. And so we don't necessarily want to fully bring in this employees table as a source of data. So we're just going to use this as an entitlements table to map that full name back to my employee ID and that employee ID back to my orders table. So even though my policy is being applied to my orders table and the full name field does not exist in my orders table, I'm going to write full name to identify this field that exists in the employees table and map this back using my full name function that we used in our previous policy to ask Tableau who is logged in and what is their full name. So even though full name doesn't exist in my orders table, through tying these two tables together by joining them by employee ID, I'm able to map the full name from my employees table back to the employee ID, back to that row in the orders table, and match that to the employee who's logged in. So the full name field is equal to the full name of the user logged in here. We can similarly look at my orders table with my data policy applied, and we can see that that is filtering down the rows of data based on Laura Callahan being logged in here. So because this table does contain a little bit of personally identifiable information, we are actually going to turn off the visibility of this employees table. So we know that from a data steward and data security perspective, we're just using that employees table as an entitlement table, and we're not going to be using that to feed any content that's in my Tableau site here. So when someone connects to this virtual connection now, the only ones they're going to be able to see are the invoices table and the orders table. And that concludes the third exercise, 3 out of 3, from our previously hands-on, now kind of walkthrough tutorial version of our virtual connections hands-on training from Tableau Conference. So before we leave today,
switch back,
yeah.
Lauren, a couple of call outs, taking a look at our virtual connection. So we did 3 different exercises. One was simply exposing tables. So think about in a real world situation where your databases and your warehouses probably have more than 3 tables in here, but you really only want to expose 3 to Tableau. That's a great way to create a data mart. So for example, if you only want to create a virtual connection for your marketing team and then another virtual connection for your sales team, you might want to keep them isolated and only expose a few of those tables for those teams. A second call out, especially for our second and third exercises, these were procedures that were commonly done within a Tableau workbook in the past, and you would have to re-engineer that workbook every time you wanted to implement row-level security. So what this does, kind of similar to what Lauren showed earlier, it pushes it up a little bit in the lineage, so it stays consistent to everything that connects downward from it. And then lastly, hiding that employees table. That's kind of the same as publishing as a published data source with row-level security applied. It's so your end user can't download the workbook, get rid of the extract filter, and then look at all of the data. So we're trying to think a step ahead to protect that data, make sure that all of that row-level security is consistent across all of the data and wherever it gets exposed.
Awesome. And before we leave you all today, we just wanted to give you all a couple of additional resources. And we had a lot of fun walking through this today. InnerWorks, one of our partners, has a really great blog post about virtual connections that you can check out. Like I mentioned, we have in our help documentation and also a couple of white papers around how to best use row-level security and how to effectively implement those policies. And to conclude, we want to say that when you're making decisions about governance, swipe left on data chaos and swipe right on virtual connections. And thank you so much for joining us for our virtual session today, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.